I've been sewing for quite a few years now, and I've really wanted to make an outfit for a really long time, and I finally feel like I have the skills to do it, so I finally decided to make a neon outfit from scratch. Fabric wise, I knew I wanted the top half to be really neon, so I opted for a sports mesh. I also like this fabric because it is see-through and I really like see-through t-shirts. And then for the bottom half of the outfit, I opted to use a cotton because I used it in a previous project and I really liked the results, so I used the exact same fabric just in orange. Design wise, I really wanted to lean into the type of outfits that I just like to wear in my general life, and for me personally, that means slightly high-waisted trousers that are quite big on me, a really tight bodysuit, and a very small t-shirt. But I also didn't want these items to rely on styling, so I wanted to make them slightly more interesting than what I normally get. So t-shirt wise, I wanted to basically copy a t-shirt that I already own that I really like wearing, but put a little design on the front to make it a little bit more unique. The bodysuit is probably the only plain element of this, but I feel like a bodysuit kind of acts as an accessory by itself, so I didn't want to go too hard with it. The only thing I wanted to add specifically was I wanted to have bigger piping around the edges just to make it look a little bit more like clothing and less like a swimming costume. And then trouser wise, I recently saw a really cute pair of pleated trousers on TikTok and I really liked the idea of adding pleats to the front of them. I also really wanted to add frills to the bottom of my trousers because again, I made trousers previously that I really liked the frills of, so I wanted to add that here as well. I feel like that's it for the intro now. We've gone through the fabric and the designs. We're finally going to get on to making it. Let's start with the t-shirt. Firstly, I took out the top I wanted to replicate and used it as a pattern piece to cut out the front and back of the t-shirt. I had to keep in mind that this mesh fabric was nowhere near as stretchy as the fabric of the t-shirt that I was replicating, so when I was cutting these pieces out, I added more room to the side seams and to the shoulder seams. I did later realize that I needed even more room than I thought I would, otherwise I wouldn't get that loose bottom edge that I wanted to achieve, so I had to add side panels onto either side of the t-shirt just to make it fit a bit better. I did also go a little bit overzealous with the neck hole, so I had to cut the shoulder seams quite a lot, which means that the armpits are slightly higher up than I wanted them to be, but I do feel like it kind of still fits the vibe. With the base pieces cut out, I then moved on to adding the little decoration onto the front of the t-shirt, and for this I used some fabric that was left over from another project out of my scrap bin. Originally I thought about having the front decal as the mesh fabric, but I opted for a fully opaque design so it stands out a lot more. For this I simply drew the design that I wanted onto the piece of fabric, traced over the lines with the sewing machine, and then flipped it the right side out to actually reveal the design. The tracing section was a little tricky as I didn't want to overlap any of the stitches at any of the points because this ruins the neat edges that I wanted to get, but overall it's actually a really simple process, especially on pieces that are this small. They really can be made with pretty much any fabric, but I've personally found that they work a lot better with non-stretch fabric, so that's why I opted for a non-stretch here. Once the piece was ironed flat, I then glued it onto the center of the chest, and it may seem weird that I'm using glue here, but I've really found that it helps to keep the pieces in place without warping all the fabric around them as you sew them, and that if you just sew them without any glue, they tend to move around a bit and make all the fabric warp strangely, especially when you're using two different types of fabric. So this is my go-to way of stopping that from happening. Obviously it does make the pieces a little bit harder, so you lose that flexibility, but for small pieces like this it's never really bothered me. I also decided to add some letters onto the front of the t-shirt just to give it a slightly more cutesy vibe, but unfortunately these letters did not survive the wash, so you'll see me have to replace them later on. To finish the shirt off, I cut out those side panels I mentioned earlier and long strips of fabric to bind all the edges. The shirt itself was very easy to sew. I simply sewed all my seams together and then top stitched them flat so they would look a little neater. I mainly did this because the fabric is see-through, so you can see the seams through the fabric, so I wanted to make them look as professional as possible. And then for the hemlines, I folded the strips of fabric I had made in half and sewed the unfolded edge directly onto the hem while lightly stretching the fabric. I stretch the fabric as I go as it makes the hemlines lay slightly more flush with the body while wearing the pieces, and it also makes it easier to go around curves without as much warping. This definitely works slightly better with slightly stretchier fabric, but I think it worked out fine for this because I used a rather thin strip of it. I also top stitched these seams into place because I wanted it to match the rest and also again to make it look neater. At this point I thought the shirt was all done and I was really happy with it, so I wore it out to a party, but because I'd gone to a party I then had to wash it, and when I washed it the lettering fully came off the front of it. Where the lettering had come off they had a slight residue of the glue left behind, so I couldn't just leave it as is, I had to replace it somehow, so I opted to use fabric paint. I took some white fabric paint from when I did my Toothless cosplay and mixed in a little bit of pink to make it match the shirt a bit better. Obviously it's a different colour, but I still think it looks better than if I just used white. I'm not the best at lettering, but this was slightly easier because I just traced along the glue stains that were left over, and it's also only a 3-letter word, so it didn't come out too messy in the end. And with that said, the shirt was now actually done and looking exactly how I wanted it to. I am super happy with how this shirt came out, and I've already worn it so many times outside the house. It's just a great piece in my opinion to wear out to the pub. I do have to remember though that it is really see-through and you can really see my nipples through it, so I tend to wear a harness harness over it or wear it with a jacket just so it's not too overly nipply. Now moving on to the bodysuit, I didn't film a lot of the bodysuit making because it was very similar to the t-shirt making process. I just cut out the pieces, sewed the base together, and then sewed the hem pieces into place. I think this piece is by far the most professional looking piece of clothing I have ever made. All the seams just came out really clean. I really like how uniform it is from top to bottom. It's also just really comfy to wear, which for me is quite a difficult thing to get with my sewing. I tend to make pieces that are slightly more uncomfortable than I planned them to be, even if they look quite comfortable. Like pairs of trousers I somehow mess up the comfortability of. So it's nice to finally see my sewing getting to the point where it not only looks good but also feels good on my body. Now I'm going to move on to the final piece of this project, which is making the trousers. These were a long process, so there's a lot of steps for this one. For these I decided to use my regular trouser pattern that I made back in January, but just add a lot more space along the waistband to get those pleats in later. Realistically, I could have added a lot more fabric to these to add a bigger pleat, but I didn't want them to be too wide at the ankle as I'm still getting used to wearing trousers that don't have elastic at the bottom. And I also knew that the more fabric I included, the more it would look like a skirt, and I personally didn't want that to happen. I don't really like the look of skirts on me. So I went in with an additional 10 centimeters of fabric on either side for each piece. I did then iron the pieces after I cut them out. It's definitely better to pre-iron the fabric before cutting out the pieces because the folds can warp the pieces and make them slightly incorrect size-wise. But I really did want to iron such a giant piece of fabric, and these pieces are very simple, so slight variations in size doesn't really matter for the final result. So I opted just to cut them out and then iron them after. Next, I sewed all my main seams together. Ordinarily, I wouldn't sew everything together at this point in the project just because it's harder to add embellishments once you're not working with a flat plane. But for these, the main embellishment is the pleats down the front of the trousers. And I knew that if I did them without making the trousers wearable first, I would make the pleats in completely the wrong position, or I would make the waistband too big or too small. I also realized at this point that the fabric is slightly see-through, which is really annoying because it means I have to think about what underwear I'm wearing underneath it. Luckily with the orange bodysuit you can't really tell that it's see-through, but it does make me feel like the only thing I can wear it with is the bodysuit, unfortunately. So I might have to buy like a piece of lycra shorts to wear underneath it that are a similar colour. Now we're on to adding on those pleats. Like I said before, I added an additional 10 centimeters onto each side of the trousers, so my pleats would need to envelop 10 centimeters of fabric to make the trousers the right size. So to do this, I marked out 5 lines all 2.5 centimeters apart, with the center marking being the point at which I want the pleats to fall. I then folded the first and fifth line into the center, cutting through the second and third mark to make each side of the pleat exactly even. And then finally, I hand sewed these pleats into place 10 centimeters down the leg. You can sew these using a machine by turning the trousers inside out and sewing down that line like a regular seam, but because I'd never done this technique before, I wanted to do it by hand so I could be sure that I was doing it correctly. And I do think they came out pretty good, and it's definitely something I want to try out more in the future because it really adds a nice texture and interest to everyday trousers. I think if I did this again, I would add a peekaboo fabric onto the pleat section. I would have to then continue the fold all the way down the leg, which would make fitting the trousers a little bit different, but I've seen some really cute pieces that have this effect with additional fabric underneath, and they look even more eccentric than the trousers that I made for this project, so they would definitely fit into my wardrobe. Next, I added pockets because I wanted these trousers to be as wearable as possible, and for me, if trousers don't have pockets, they're kind of pointless. To do this, I sewed 2 pieces of fabric inside the seam lines of my trousers right side together. This does look a little bit odd while sewing, and it often confuses me, but you just have to think of the front and the back side of the trousers as completely separate pieces and pretend as if your pocket panel is going face down with the piece that you're sewing it to. I then sewed the panels together to create a closed pocket and flipped the trousers the right way out to do the rest of the sewing. First, I marked down to where I wanted the opening of the pocket to end, which for these trousers was 10 centimeters down from the waistline, and then I flipped the pocket onto the back side of the trousers to sew down the front seam allowance down to that point that I just marked. Then I flipped the pocket back to the other side that I wanted to lay when I'm actually wearing the trousers and sew down the seam allowance on that side as well. I also decided to go all the way down the leg at this point just to close off that seam completely. With the seams now sewn into place, I could just join them together at that end point. This line of stitching will act as the stopper to stop the pocket opening more than you want it to. I then used the seam ripper to open up that pocket just down the original seam of the trousers, but if you're really careful you can pull these seams apart a little bit and just cut them with scissors. However, seam rippers are just so handy when it comes to things like this because there's a much lower risk of creating holes in your fabric. With this seam gone, I now had a completely usable pocket. Next, we can go on to the waistband, which I actually did twice because I really didn't like how it ended up the first time. The first time I did it, I just cut out my waistband pieces, which is half cotton and half mesh, and sewed them completely along the top line of the trouser trousers with a little bit of elastic at the back to make it a better fit. And they fit fine, but they were a little bit awkward to pull up just because the elastic didn't stretch enough. And I also just had a bit of gapping at the front that I didn't really know how to fix because adding more elastic would make them harder to pull up. So I opted to take them apart and put on a zipper instead. To add in the zip, I first needed to sew the entire waistband back onto the trousers, but only at the front and not the back. So I laid my fabrics right side together and sewed all the way along the top seam of my trousers. This basically was just extending the trousers up by twice my waistband width. I then sewed an invisible zipper into the side seams of the right hand side of the trousers. This is one of the seams that I just added by adding the pocket. You just open up the seam allowance and sew the zip face down into the seam. Once it's sewn into place, the seam could then just be ripped apart to reveal the zipper. This is definitely the easiest way to sew in invisible zippers, but they are still really fiddly to do. And I'm actually quite happy with how this one turned out despite it being slightly messy. And I also had to go in with a little bit of hand sewing because I missed the seam in places. So I ended up with a little bit of raw seams on the inside of the zipper piece. But overall, as something that I had to add in last minute that I wasn't planning to originally, I feel like it came out okay. Next, I decided to add a decorative button onto the front of the trousers just because I find waistbands without buttons or pull ties a little bit awkward to look at. For this, I made a little panel just to give my button a backdrop and to break up the neon of the waistband a little bit, and then sewed it directly onto my trousers. I then hand sewed the button into place and I feel like it looks really cute, kind of a pointless addition, but I like it. Finally, I wanted to finish off my trousers by adding frills and ribbons onto the bottom. I did this frill design for my toothless trousers and they were really inspired by a TikTok that I saw, and I just love how they look, so I wanted to do the exact same thing again. I started out by cutting out 2 long strips of cotton fabric, folding them in half and then gathering them to the circumference of my trouser legs. This is probably the easiest thing to do to add interest to a pair of trousers. Even if you bought a pair of trousers, you could add this so easily onto the bottom by just following the bottom hem. With the frills sewn into place, I then needed to cover the raw edges, so I sewed a wide ribbon over the top of them with just a straight top stitch. And while these originally came out very cute, they did make the trousers slightly too short, so I had to go in again and make them even longer. To do this, I just had to cut the inside layer of the frills free so I could extend the leg downwards a little bit. I also added a hem with the orange mesh to add a little bit more interest and to tie the bottom of the trousers to the waistband and the bodysuit a little bit more. So while it was really annoying to extend them after the fact, I feel like they came out a little bit cuter. I really like the added little neon element to it. So in a way, I'm kind of glad that I messed up the first time. With that said, I'm actually done explaining the process of this, so we can finally go on to showing you the final result. I am so happy with how this outfit turned out, especially the top. I feel like I've already said this, but I've worn this so many times since I made it. It's just so cute and goes so well into my wardrobe. It's exactly the sort of thing that I like to wear on a daily basis. I also love having something that's more gender affirming because it's pink, but it says boy on it, and I just really like that. And I feel like it's a good addition to my wardrobe and makes me feel like I should add some more gender specific but campy things into my everyday wear. With the trousers, like I said before, I'm actually kind of glad that I had to add this extra piece to them because I feel like it makes them look even more interesting than they were before. And it also really ties the trousers together because the neon on the bottom really does tie in the top and make the whole thing look a little bit more cohesive. The only issue I'm having with these trousers is that they wrinkle really easily. I've washed these twice since I made them and they are just so wrinkled, and I'm not a good ironer. I'm kind of thinking that I should spray them down with starch because starch kind of breaks up all of the wrinkles and will hopefully make them wrinkle less in the future. And yeah, I feel like that is all my thoughts. I know I didn't talk about the bodysuit, but I feel like I kind of covered that in the bodysuit section. So I'm going to end this video here. If you did enjoy it, please give it a like down below, comment what else you'd like me to do, and subscribe as I post a new video every single week, and I'd love to see you again. But until then, bye!